Hello, everyone. Welcome to another screening series Q&A. My name is Camelia Shofani, and I'm the Senior Manager of Public Programs and Events at the International Documentary Association. For our blind or low vision attendees, I have dark curly hair, light skin, and brown eyes with a black shirt. I'd like to thank our sponsors KCRW and Variety for making this possible. If you're interested in more of our screenings or Q&As, please visit documentary.org/screening-series. Tonight, we're going to be having a conversation between moderator Claudia Puig, director Iliana Sosa, Isidore Bethel, and producer Emma Miller, whose film What We Leave Behind premiered at South by Southwest earlier this year. Before we get started, I'd like to offer a brief land acknowledgement. We recognize the Gabrielino Tongva as the past, present, and future caretakers of the land, water, and cultural resources in the unceded territory of Los Angeles. So Claudia, handing it over to you.
Hi, I'm Claudia Puig. I'm also wearing a black top and I also have dark hair and dark eyes, but we're not related. And I am so fortunate to have with me today the wonderful writer-director of What We Leave Behind, Iliana Sosa, and the, I think, co-writer and co-editor and co-producer Isidore Bethel, and then the co-producer Emma Miller. Thank you so much for this film. This is just such a beautiful, intimate, lyrical, and moving love letter to your grandfather and also to Mexico, to his homeland. And I just was really, I've seen it a few times now, and every time I find something new. So Iliana, how did you come up with, when and how did you come up with the idea to film your grandfather and to document what turned out to be his final days?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, Claudia and IDA, for having us here. It's, really wonderful to be here. And I just want to make a note that Emma is actually the producer on the film. So just wanted to state that. But I started this project back in 2014. So it was, over 6 years ago. It's been a 7-year journey. And, I first was intrigued about my grandfather's work as a bracero. And for those of you who may not know what braceros are, during World War II, the US government contracted Mexican farm workers to have, there was a shortage of labor. So a lot of these men came to the US and worked all over. And my grandfather was one of these men. And he would always come back and forth between Mexico and the US, and he raised 7 children on his own, and frequently would leave my mom, who was the oldest, with her other siblings. And I always thought, wow, that was how would, what was that journey like for him? And so that was my first sort of interest in trying to get to know him and trying to get to know what those journeys for him were like when he would travel, here to the US.
Absolutely. 7 years is a really long filming journey. And Emma and Isidora, were you on the project the whole time as well? Oh, you're on mute.
Apologies, rookie mistake. So I think for the first, several years, Iliana was largely just going and doing everything herself. I mean, she would travel from Texas to Mexico, and she was filming, she was doing sound, she was directing, she was producing. And it wasn't until some funding came in several years later that she started being able to bring on a crew. And so that started with our amazing sound recordist Glenda Charles, and our DPs Monica Weiss and Judy Fu. And then Isidore actually came on board and was working with Iliana, putting together a cut of the film. And Isidore was the one who sort of connected me with Iliana to bring me on, which was now, about 2 years ago. So I think at that stage, there was a recognition that, this is such a personal film, such a personal story. And at that point, having some outside eyes for that sort of next chapter of the push creatively, and then thinking about how to position the film and the story in the world was something that was needed. So, I mean, it's just been an incredible collaborative experience with these, these two. But I really do think that Iliana can say more about this. It was that kind of slow building of a team, and kind of it morphing from something that was like, really her wearing all the hats to her, have it, as kind of the leader of this beautiful project.
Isidore, I saw you nodding your head. Did you want to add something here?
I'll start off by giving a visual description of myself. I'm a male with light skin, a few days of beard, and I have a small bandage on my temple. I had a biking accident about 2 months ago, and I'm against a white background in a navy t-shirt, short, dark blonde hair. I came onto the film probably, I think it was like in late 2019. Iliana had been looking for an editor and had met a producer that I'd worked with in the past, someone named Jamie Gonsalves. And Jamie produced a film that I directed, and he also produced another film that I'd edited, and was like, "Oh, Iliana, why don't you talk to Isidore?" And the only thing that Jamie told me before meeting Iliana was like, "I don't know anything about her film. Like, you can assess that, you can like judge that, but like she's the warmest person I met at Sundance this year." And I was like, "Okay, like, I mean, Jamie is someone I really love." And I was like, that counts for something. And I think Julián and I had a call. I apologize. I'm a little bit like, I have a little bit of a cold. So both my voice and my head are kind of like a little bit foggy. I remember having a call with Julián and coming away from it being like, oh my God, there's something like radiant and enigmatic and hard-edged but beautiful in this person. And if her work is anything like who she is, then this is a gem. And that kind of, over the course of the subsequent few weeks, it was clear that her material like reflected who she is. And it was just a task of kind of like teasing out her identity from the raw footage. And it was maybe about 8 or 9 months later that I put Emma and Iliana in contact, and Emma's someone that I've been wanting to find a way to work with for many years. So this was like a particular delight to matchmake.
I never think about that aspect of filmmaking, but that's so true. Iliana, I love how down to earth and decent and good-hearted and kind your grandfather seems. I feel like I would want him as a grandfather too. And I feel like you must have had so many wonderful memories from your childhood, because he would come up right to the United States constantly.
Yeah.
Oh, go on. Yes.
Oh, no, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
No. Please tell us about those. And I mean, was this idea sort of germinating with you for a long time?
Not particularly. I mean, he would come, often to El Paso, and like in the film, in the voiceover, he'd bring all sorts of things like Mennonite cheese and jamoncillo candy, and like and he'd always smoke. Back then he always had his pack of cigarettes and would always smoke. So I have these memories of him doing that. But it wasn't until I remember living in LA and telling a friend of mine about him and just his travels, and he'd come every month and sort of describe that journey, because it's a rather long bus journey, around 13 hours to get from Durango to Juarez, and then having to cross over again to El Paso. So, and he would just go by himself, and, well into his 80s, just traveling by himself. And she's like, wow, that's really fascinating. Have you ever thought of maybe filming him? Or, I had this inclination of wanting to take that journey and film with him, but I didn't quite know what the story would be, if it would be of interest to anybody, and it was at a point, and I feel this about the film, it was it came at a crossroads in my life where I was leaving, a job and sort of trying to figure out what I wanted to do as a filmmaker. I also do fiction, but I really wanted to dive into documentary. And so it was like, I feel like the film found me in many ways. And also him, even though I grew up with him coming to see us every month, I didn't quite have a very close relationship with him. I didn't sometimes know how to speak to him, or he, even though I'm fluent in Spanish, he has a certain way of speaking, a very particular dialect. And so I sometimes didn't understand him. Like, my mother was so intrinsic in all of this process. And, you can ask Isidore, but even during filming, but also in post-production, I'd frequently ask her, what is he saying here? What is he, and she was just so fundamental in that process. And it was really during the last leg of filming and that interview where I asked him quite bluntly, like, are you afraid to go? And he answers in a very beautiful way that he's not. And I think at that point is when we had finally, I think, really understood each other, not only culturally, but linguistically, and really came to understand who we were, very different people, even though we're from the same family, right? So I think the journey didn't quite start. It developed over time, and my relationship with him and the film changed over time as a result.
That's fascinating. Well, I love the title because I feel like it has so many layers of, what we leave behind, like the generations that came to the United States, and then also what he left behind. I kept thinking about how important it was for him to build the house. And he wanted to leave it for his children. And, but again, many of the kids, the 7 kids and grandchildren were living in the US. Was he able to see it finished? And is someone living in it now? That just stayed in my head afterwards.
Yeah, he was able to see it finish. I mean, what you see in the film, the final scene, is pretty much how the house is now. There's been some additions to it. It has now like electricity, but it's pretty much he was able to see it in that state. I mean, not fully furnished or anything, but and then to answer your other question, no one lives in the house. It's still there. It's still pretty much in the same shape as it was when I finished filming. And I'm not sure what the family wants to do with it. I know that they'll keep it, but I'm not sure who will live there. But it is a space that is there for anyone that wants to come back.
That's nice. And your uncle Jorge? I thought about him and I thought about Pinto, who I loved. It's like that. I love that dog. So where are they now?
Yeah, well, Jorge still lives in the same house that he lived with my grandfather and has very much the same routine. He still sleeps in the same room that my grandfather, where they both slept. So he hasn't changed his routine, and he's still, doing the same thing. I have conversations with my mom where, she's like, oh, Jorge's very much becoming like your grandfather, and and just in his way of being, and he knows where everything is in the house. So, and I don't know, it's been a bittersweet, I think, moment with my family with this film. It's a constant reminder, but for him, like what the film tackles, he would never say what he's feeling, right, in terms of when my grandfather passed. I know it was a huge loss, but again, it's something that's unspoken, right? What type of grief he's going through, I'm not sure. Pinto, he actually, he died, that the dog died, right, even before we finished the film. Yeah, he died. So, but yeah, he was such a sweet dog.
Yeah. You felt like you kind of knew, everybody there, because your camera just kind of followed everybody, on a daily way. I loved the sort of when he's frying up his egg and he's saying it's nice and crispy, like I like it, and just like all those little moments. Was this sort of naturalistic style something that Emma, you and Iliana, Isidore too, can chime in? You discussed that you wanted it to have this sort of naturalistic kind of style and deliberate pacing.
And I think one thing that we talked about, especially as the process of working on the voiceover and drawing out Iliana's voice in the film, there was a recollection of certain memories. And I remember Iliana saying to me at one point that, there were the times that she would go down to film and visit were times where she felt like deeply at peace, because there's this slowing down that happens when you're there. You're not on your phone, you're not like answering emails. It's just a different way of life. And so something that I think that we had conversations about is how can the film, in the way that through the imagery, through the pacing, through the rhythms, how can that be capturing what that place feels like for viewers? And so I think that what you're alluding to with the naturalism, some of that just came out of, I think the way that Iliana filmed, and her presence and her patience and her, her kind of gentleness behind the camera, just bearing witness to what was happening. But also, I think Isidore could speak about the choices in the edit to really let those moments play out and sort of settle into that pace, to take viewers there as well. I don't know if Izzy, you want to add something to that.
Sure. I think that there's a waterfall effect at play where it's like Julián had an impact on Iliana that Iliana was able to embrace, and she was able to slow down and accept his logic, his wit, his ways of constructing language and social interaction. And thanks to Iliana's comfort with that, she was able to bring in Monica Wise and Judy Fu with the camera, and then Glenda Charles with the sound, who also adapted and embraced what Julián and Jorge had to do, and like loved their banter and would hang out at the end of the day when they were like finished drinking. They would have finished drinking when they were finished shooting. They would have beers. They would enjoy each other's company. And I think that like the love that kind of characterized what was happening on set inevitably came through into the images. And then my job years later, like inheriting that footage, was just to listen to it and to be like, oh, this is where this person is finishing their thought. This is where this action is over. And the starts and the ends, it's not really different from anything I would do on any other film, except that this film's material was special, and it was from a special place, with special people who were telling me in their own ways where a shot should start and where it should end, where a scene should start, where it should end, and what the most kind of fascinating and exciting collisions between those scenes could be. So yeah, I think it's mostly just about embracing what these people have to teach us.
You make that sound easy, but I'm guessing that with 7 years of footage, it must have been a challenge to not so much editing those individual scenes, because it makes a lot of sense letting them play out, but just editing all the footage and deciding what to include and what not to include. How many hours of footage did you have?
I think on the films that I've edited so far, there are two approaches that generally kind of come to the fore. One is like you can think you have a big block of marble and you chisel away until you get to the sculpture. And then another one is like you have a blob of clay and you just pull little odds and ends until you assemble a clay sculpture. I think there was something with this footage, particularly because it was in the Duranguense dialect, that Iliana probably understood, correct me if I'm wrong, I would say 85% of what your grandfather was saying. And like, I speak Spanish fluently, but I was at like 55, 65% of what Julián was saying, 95% of what Jorge was saying, but it made de-rushing and like making selections a lot more exhausting for us, even when we were together in the same room. And then when we were de-rushing remotely over like Skype or Zoom or WhatsApp, it meant that I think there were about 130 hours total, but there was a lot of footage that I wouldn't watch in its totality, which is very unusual for me, just because it was hard. It was hard footage to work through. So we kind of did a tag team thing with Iliana, where Iliana would say, okay, how about this day you look at this footage? Meanwhile, I'm editing. I'm like pulling things into a timeline and like constructing. It was a lot more organic than other films where I've been much more systematic or methodical. Yeah, I don't know if that's an adequate answer, but it kind of just like it happened, and conversations with Iliana influenced like what then took place in the edit, and then we would watch and have notes and like kind of rinse and repeat. And when Emma came on board, probably a little under a year before we picture locked, it was the three of us in the room kind of figuring out how this story is taking shape.
Because you really condensed so many years and so much depth into a very, very concise time. Was it 71 minutes? That's pretty short. So that's kudos to doing something like that. And your film is also this meditation about migration and the U.S.-Mexico border. And I wondered if you, as the daughter, I'm a daughter of Mexican immigrants too, Iliana, and I've thought a lot about it. I've been thinking more about it as I get older. You know, when you're a kid, you just sort of accept the way everything is. But I wondered if you've thought a lot about your relationship to Mexico and the border and all of that since while you were making it and since making it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm first generation. I was born and raised here, and I thought about that a lot because unlike some other of my family members, some of my aunts are undocumented. And when my grandfather passed away, one aunt wasn't able to go. So I was, I FaceTimed her from his hospital bed. And, that really, that was hard because because of my privilege, right? Because I have citizenship, I was able to freely cross back and forth and make this film. I didn't have that, that issue of not being able to travel. And when my grandfather was really sick and my aunt wasn't able to go, that really was just like, oh, it really made me aware. I mean, throughout this whole process to even make a film, right, to have, the resources to do it, although it took a long time to find them, but that's very much something that I am very aware of. And at the same time, I feel really proud of this film, proud of our team, proud that faces like my grandfather and like Jorge and my family exist. And, his story is now here for people to see. And I've been getting a flood of so many messages of people now watching the film on Netflix, saying how much it's reminded them of their homeland, of their abuelitos, abuelitas, a family that they haven't seen in years. And, I think that's the beauty of the film. And I feel really, really proud that's how this is resonating with our community. So as a daughter of Mexican immigrants who, I never thought that I'd, first of all, like finish this film. It was a really long journey, and it started as a small idea, and I sort of didn't even know where it would go to or how I'd finish, but I knew I needed to, I wanted to, for the sake of just my grandfather as well. That I think that's something that's still painful, is that I wasn't able to finish in time for him. But I have reconciled that the way it's affecting people is, I think he loved to travel, and the film has, in a very beautiful way, has been all over the country and continues to. And having even this conversation with you today, Claudia, is beautiful testament to the fact that his spirit is still here and is still very much a part of all of the journey that we've been on with it.
That's really beautiful. Was it hard? I was thinking about the scene where people are gathered around him when he's lying in bed. That must have been a really hard scene to film. Where were you in that sort of process?
Yeah, at that point, I didn't know, there was no film crew with me at that time. It was just me. It was, my mother was there, my other family. I was just me filming on my cell phone, that scene, actually. I didn't know if I wanted to really film when my grandfather was really sick. My mother and I went down to see him, as well as other family. And it was a difficult decision. I mean, I took my phone and like a small camcorder and only recorded moments that I felt I wanted to. I didn't, when my grandfather passed, all of the town came out, and they, with his coffin, like literally were carrying it through the town. I mean, it's a very particular tradition in Mexico and rural towns to carry the coffin and go into the cemetery. And I didn't film all of that. I think it could have, and that would have maybe made it into the film, but I just didn't feel like I needed to. But in that moment, with him in the rosary, I did. And everyone was there, my mom, my aunts, and my uncle. And yeah, it was just, I think it's also a reminder to me of like, I'm in many ways, I'm so grateful my grandfather didn't have to experience COVID. He didn't die alone. Everyone was there with him, everyone that could be there, right? And so for that, I'm really grateful. And I think that's how he wanted us to be there and celebrate his life in that way, right? And honoring him and saying goodbye in that way. So even though it was difficult, I also feel like I'm glad that scene is there, because that's how many Mexican families and other cultures around the world, you're celebrating life and death at the same time in that moment, right? You're saying goodbye, but you're also with them, and honoring them and wishing them this other journey, right? So
I just all of a sudden it hit me that I don't know when this will be viewed, but we are recording this on Day of the Dead.
we
So
are today's
yeah. So this is really, it feels really appropriate. I loved how your grandfather spoke about your grandmother, who he had lost when she was quite young. But I love that he said, I asked and she said yes. And it was just like, that's all that really matters. And I wondered if you'd like tried to draw him out more, or just like, that was such a perfect thing to include. I loved it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think, in my mind and a lot of the responses, sometimes I wish I would have, gotten more thorough response, but in many ways that's how he viewed the world, and that was enough. And I think that's okay. And I love that response too. Like, it was very simple. It was, yeah, they had the connection, and that's all that's needed, so I don't know. I love that he was just like, I talked to her and she said yes, and then
Yeah.
so it's also, I think, a very just uncomplicated way of looking at the world, which I think I feel like I learned a lot about him and in the world in that way by making the film.
Well, I wanted to ask all three of you too, what were the most challenging aspects of putting this film together? And they may have been different for all of you, or they may have been the same. I'll start with you, Emma.
Yeah, I mean, what you were just asking about, that moment or the tension between maybe the uncomplicatedness of Julián's responses versus perhaps like what Iliana was hoping to get from him in those moments. I think that I wouldn't necessarily say this was a challenge, but I do think that there was a journey creatively as far as shifting the way we thought about, like those kinds of responses or asking questions and maybe not getting the answers that Iliana initially hoped for, not seeing that as a limitation, but seeing that as something that was like a really beautiful representation of the difference in her perspective and her family's perspective. So for example, that scene with Jorge at the kitchen table, where it's, there's these silences, there's these moments where she's trying to draw something out of him that he just doesn't have necessarily the language to respond to. I think that actually sort of opened it up for us to be able to incorporate more of Iliana's voice and perspective in the film. And that's, that voiceover, all the vignettes that are her voice, came as sort of a later stage addition as a way to kind of orient what was going on for her in those kinds of moments. What are those differences in her experience versus her family's experience? So yeah, I think that kind of being open to that sort of evolution and recognizing that, a lack of emotional demonstrativeness is not necessarily a limitation or something that means that, like, you're not getting what you need from a character. And I think beyond that, that there doesn't need to be like this kind of dramatic narrative to make something really merit, a film and the patience and attention of a viewer. So anyway, that's a little bit of a rambly answer, but I hope that makes sense.
It's a great answer. Yeah. Well, and I want to ask you more about the challenges, but you made me think of something when you mentioned her voiceover, which is so great. But I also love how the silences play out. You're not afraid of those silences, and I really appreciated that balance between the voiceover and the silences. That's not a question. That was more of a comment. So going back to the challenges, Isidore, do you want to add to that?
I can talk a little bit about the voiceovers. I think ultimately, like on this film, there weren't that many challenges because of like good attitudes among the three of us and a lack of urgent deadlines. So it was just sort of like, I'll speak to the voiceovers because that was something that was tricky, but we had the time for it not to be really that challenging. It was just sort of like, oh, we should set the film aside for a couple months until we have like creative insights into how to continue. But we got into something of an impasse maybe in like late 2020, where the cut of the film was pretty much there. Iliana had a desire for it to reflect her experiences visiting Durango, like in particular, like what the land made her feel. And for me as an editor, I'm only getting sounds and images. And I'm kind of like, so what? Like you have these feelings about the land, but I can't just like make those feelings come out of nothing. And I don't want to put landscape shots into like what is a really strong edit. But Iliana had this feeling, and of course, like she's the director, we have to figure out how this feeling like finds an outlet. So we waited several months. It was great. And after waiting several months, all three of us had this desire to dive into a form of writing where Iliana would say a lot of things. Iliana and I were in person together at the Jacob Burns Center in Pleasantville, New York. Sean Wiener had invited Iliana, and Sean was like an incredible advocate for the film and gave us the opportunity to be in person sort of at the early stages of the pandemic lightening up in terms of restrictions. So Iliana would say a lot of things about what she remembered about Durango, what was going through her mind as she was filming, legends that she remembered about her grandfather. I would transcribe all of them and try to shape them into something. Maybe I'm also misremembering this because I remember you, Iliana, you put a lot of things into a Google Doc that was also sort of this well that we could draw on. Anyway, we kind of like, we had a very messy generative process, but that ultimately through kind of back and forth with Emma, who was off site, but who would offer feedback and sort of modifications and edits. We came upon the 4 voiceovers that are in the film that really kind of punctuate it and give a sense of who is lensing and voicing the film. So that like could have been a challenge in a different setup, but it just kind of emerged and was really lovely.
So you finished all your shooting before the pandemic then, and it was a matter of putting it together.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was very fortunate. Iliana, how about any personal challenges that you felt?
Oh man, that's a good question. I don't think anyone's asked me that actually. Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of challenges. I think, before I met Isidore and Emma, and I mean, when I was just sitting with really early, like even just rough cuts of like just small samples of the footage, I just didn't really know like what direction to take with it. I felt lost a lot of the time. I mean, to be really honest, and I think that happens with making a personal film, right? You're trying to figure out, well, what is it that you want to say? How do you want to film? How do you want to ask the questions? What questions do you want to ask, especially of family members and so learning how to, communicate with my grandfather, with Jorge, and I think there's all of those challenges too. But I think personally also being very mindful of, how am I representing my family and what's my grandfather's role in this process? Is he enjoying it too? Is he also actively participating? And I mean, and he loved the camera, and he would wake up in the mornings and say, let's go film this, let's do this. But, I think all of those questions were also very much part of the process. And also like, it was, emotionally difficult, really to make this film. The first early years, you start questioning a lot of things, right? About your identity, or just like who, this is my family, and what does that mean? And who are they? Like, who are these people? Because I think when I started asking questions of other family members, I got, responses that I didn't expect, and things that I didn't know about that were really difficult to hear from. I had a lot of interviews with my aunts, with my other uncle, and things that I didn't know that had happened to them in their journeys of coming here to the US, really painful things. And so what do you do with all of that knowledge? How do you wrestle with that, knowing that that's part of your family and very an intrinsic part of you? So yeah, I think, but all in all, I'm very grateful that we got to where we are now with it. And I'm still, I think, processing a lot of it, especially after my grandfather's passing, and the effect it has had on people, the effect it's had on my family, on my mother.
I was going to ask you about that, what your mother thinks of the film, and sort of, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I think she's very proud of it. I mean, it's so funny. My father and her are they're like such strong advocates for the film, and I'm very, very grateful for that. And my whole family has been very supportive, but I think it's still very hard. It's very hard for her to watch it. She's only really watched it once, and that was at our premiere at South by Southwest, and that was really really hard for her. So I know she can't fully watch it again, and I understand that. And there was other family members who didn't want to see it even after we were done. So now everyone has, but it's taken some time, and I've been very mindful and respectful of that, because that's something that even before we locked picture too, Isidore and I were very intentional about making sure she was okay with everything portrayed, right? So we showed it to her before we locked picture. So, it's been an interesting process, but one that's also, I think she's just very, very proud of what's happening with it.
As she should be. So look, I think we're running low on time, but I'm going to ask you one last question about film was released in theaters. It was via Ava DuVernay's company Array, and obviously it's currently available on Netflix too. How did the Array situation come about? Did Ava see it at South by, or how did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, this is funny because this also went through my mind when you asked about challenges. I think, you know, I think there's it is a hard landscape in some ways right now for independent film. I think sometimes, films that don't immediately tick the boxes of this is going to be commercial, or this is, this has a big name attached to it. Like there's a little bit of a dismissal at face value, some people in the industry. And so, we didn't have a sales agent going into our South by premiere. And we truly we knew this was something that if people could see it, like we knew there was an audience for it. And so we just reached out to Array. And this was just like personally, I mean, we thought that, it could be a fit, and, immediately they saw the film and were, sort of responded and said, "This is beautiful. We'd love to talk more with you." But I think it was really self-advocacy on our part. And that was something that, has really been the case through a lot of this process. It's sort of like, we have to seek the attention ourselves. And I think perhaps there's a little bit of pigeonholing or dismissal of, this is a film that will only appeal to, certain viewers. And I think something that we continue to have seen since the release at South by, when, the festival ended up adding an extra screening, and we won several awards. Like, it's not just Latinx viewers that this resonates with. This, despite the specificity of Iliana's experiences, the themes of grief, of aging, of legacy, of family, of disconnection, like those are universal subjects that I think, people will be like, this reminds me of my Jewish grandmother. This reminds me of, my family in Pakistan that I haven't seen in several years. So, but yes, all the amazing things that have happened as far as being able to connect with audiences started out with us just kind of putting the film forth. And we're very, very grateful to, Array and Tillian Jones, who's the president there, for taking a chance on the film, I think, in some ways. And I think it's been, really gratifying to see that. I think that, we were right in thinking that it would continue to resonate if it would only just be made available and accessible in that way. So yeah, very excited.
I have one quick last question. I'm going to squeeze it in. So your grandfather, the whole bracero thing, that he worked hard as a bracero, he went back and forth. This goes back to the early 60s. How did you figure out because you could have almost done a whole separate documentary on that. So
Yeah.
how do you balance all that, and how much information to give and all that kind of background?
Yeah. And I'll answer, but I would love Isidore to talk about this too, because that's something that we did talk about. And I actually had a very different version of this film that was a little bit more, that included more of that, more archival. It was maybe more of your traditional documentary. But I knew that that's not what I wanted to make. And I know I could have focused maybe more on that, on his stories, and solely on that whole program. But in many ways, I knew that I wanted to just sit in the stillness of this place with him, and I think there's more to say, and the moment, when he's frying up that egg, right, speaks volumes rather than having an archival of like what this program was. So, and many of the mysteries of even that program, of how much our elders have sacrificed and what they exactly have gone through, we don't know. So in many ways, we're taking viewers on that journey. Like, there is that information, but it's so limited. That one photograph of him as a bracero is the only photograph we have of him, which is, it's wild to think that. That documentation, that's all. And so many of these braceros too, we don't know who they were. Many of them have passed, their stories have gone. So that limited information is also limited in scope in our own family.
Yeah.
I'll just add to that where, I think the scene that's in the film about Julián's past as a bracero kind of sums up everything that Iliana might have wanted to communicate contextually or informationally. He spent a lot of time, decades of his life, going back and forth between Mexico and the US, working in the US, enduring exploitative conditions, getting screwed over in the end in terms of his social security. All of that comes out in like banter between him and his son and Iliana. And I think in the edit, what we always favored was, where are there present day emotional stakes for the people who are in the room? And in that moment, Julián really knew that Iliana had this interest about his past as a bracero. And he was like, oh, here's a prop that I can show you. And like, let me tell you a little anecdote about like how ridiculous it is that they screwed me over because I was like using my brother-in-law's Mika identification card. So it's something where like he's making kind of a joke, but that has real like historical familial resonance, and that is bittersweet and funny, but that is mostly about creating a bond in the present with Iliana. And it's sort of like, we always wanted the things that had contemporary stakes to them.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, Iliana, Emma, and Isidore, thank you so much. This has been such a fascinating conversation. Thank you for this wonderful film. And to those watching, be sure to tell your friends. It's on Netflix. And I just really enjoyed speaking with the three of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.